This week, your assignments in journalism revolve around the concept of interviewing. In order to write most journalism stories, you're going to have to do some type of interviewing. So it's good for us to take a look at interviewing and what it is. Your goal when you set out to do an interview is to get accurate and interesting information for your story. There are several strategies available to get your subject to talk. And using these strategies and understanding these strategies will make not only for a better interview, but also for a better news story. The first thing you want to do when you sit down with an interviewee to conduct an interview is to build trust. A source that trusts you will be more likely to open up, and that's what you want them to do. You want them to give you full access to the story, not all the information you already know. To establish trust, you may need to spend some time with your subjects. So, depending on the type of story that you're writing, you may need to devote many hours to the interview. If you are on a beat, meaning that you're assigned to a specific type of story or even a specific topic regularly, then you may want to socially network with your most important and your recurring sources. So if you go to the same person on a weekly basis to get their opinions or to find out about a story, you may want to spend a lot of time with them in order to build that trusting relationship. You need to remember that your sources are human beings, not computers, not robots, and you need to treat them as such. They have their own jobs, they have their own responsibilities, and they're 100% not there to just talk to you. Your sources are going to respond better to you if you have a good track record with them, so make sure that you are respectful of them. And remember that honesty and empathy always work. Be empathetic of their situation and what they're dealing with, and be honest with them about what your story is going to entail and the kind of information that you're looking for. Most of the time when you conduct an interview, you'll want to do a funnel interview. Okay? What that means is you're going to save your toughest questions for last. You're going to start very broad with very general questions. This enables you time to build trust with your interview subject. So if you're interviewing someone for the first time, you're going to want to start with, some background information. Where did they grow up? Where did they go to college? Maybe what was their childhood like? Depending on the type of story you're writing, those background questions will be different, but you want to start broad. You don't want to go right for the kill questions from the beginning, because that's oftentimes going to shut down your source and they're not going to share with you the information that you really need. There are some trust busters out there, some things that will completely annihilate any trust that you've built with a source. First, burning a source with bad ink. What this means is if you have a source that you rely on, don't publish bad things about them in the paper, because that's going to cause them not to talk to you anymore, and now you've lost their trust and lost that source. Also, misquoting a source. Make sure that if you choose to use a quote, you check it, that you know that is exactly what they said, because if you misquote a source and you misquote them bad enough, it's likely to make them not talk to you again. And identifying anonymous sources. When a source asks to remain anonymous, there are only certain reasons that you can break that anonymity, and those are very specific. If you identify a source that has asked to be remained anonymous, don't ever expect them to talk to you again. Also, misrepresenting your intentions. If you go to conduct an interview and you tell them that you're there for one reason, and in reality you're there for a completely different reason, that's a trust buster for most people, because when your story comes out, they're going to see it and they're going to know that that wasn't your real intention. Also, failure to answer any concerns or questions that the source may have before the interview. Sometimes sources, they are concerned because maybe you're asking them about a very sensitive topic, and they may have some questions as to who you've already talked to, what information you already have, and you should answer their questions as completely and fully as you can in order to make sure that they feel comfortable talking to you. You also need to remember that your first encounter with the source is critical, since that's when your first impression is made. So the first time you talk with a source, make sure you're professional, that you're open, and that you're honest, because that's the only way you're going to continue to build a trusting relationship. In most cases, you'll want to put the source at ease. That means make them feel comfortable talking with you and make them feel comfortable knowing that you're going to represent them truthfully in your article. However, in some serious interviews, you may want to deliberately create tension and use that tension to your advantage. When you're dealing with certain types of people, sometimes the topics are very hard to discuss, and keeping that tension will create a more honest interview. Sometimes it's important to use what we call the inverted funnel. What this means is you start with your tough and specific questions first. This is best used when if you have very little time or you need to nail down an answer and you just don't have time for all the fluffy stuff. So you start with your hardest questions. You do need to be prepared, though, that if you start with your toughest questions, you may shut down your source right away and not get the information you need. Preparing for an interview is just as important as conducting it. Preparation strategies for an interview vary a lot depending on the type of interview that you're doing. What kind of interview are you doing? Is this a news story? Is it a profile or a feature? You're looking at a specific person and you're going to be talking about them. Is it investigative? Or are you doing something for broadcast and TV? So depending on those kinds of interviews, you're going to prepare a little differently. When you're doing the news story, you want to use all available resources to research the history of the subject covered. You want to know what has already been covered, what's already out there, because you don't want to repeat those things. You want to look for the new edge of the story. You want to go direct to the source, but don't expect them to tell you the whole story. Okay. Oftentimes, if there's something happens locally, you want to start with the person at the center of the conflict, at the center of the story, but they're not likely to tell you everything. So that sometimes means that you need to talk to people who know them, peripheral people in the story. And off-the-record insider may help you get a fresh perspective. So you need to maybe think about using them as well. What does it mean to be off the record? Well, whether or not you should use something or talk to people off the record is a hotly debated topic. What it means when somebody's off the record is they're talking freely about a topic, but you can't use any of it. They're saying that I am going to tell you this, and it may help your story, and it might give you some direction, but you can't use anything that I say. I'm telling you right now that this is not allowed to be recorded. This is not allowed to be printed. Some people believe that you should always tell them, no, I'm not. We are not going off the record. Some journalists question whether it's ethical to gather info off the record. Some say yes, some say no, and so that's kind of a decision that you have to make. Should everything be fair game? Some journalists feel that when they sit down with a source, that they tell the source up front, anything that you tell me, I have the right and the privilege to print. We will not go off the record at any point. Other journalists feel that there are some personal things that maybe should be left off the record. Another thing that you need to think about, can you use information gained off the record without directly quoting the information of the source? Well, that's really dependent. If they're the only person who could possibly know that information, if you use it on the record or off the record, you're causing them harm and you're going to lose their trust and lose that source. Normally, if somebody asks to be off the record, it is best that you don't use that information, or you find somebody who also has that information who's willing to go on the record and allow you to quote them. If a subject during an interview says, hey, I want to go off the record, you should really try to get them to stay on the record. That's the best option because that's the way you're going to be able to use most of what's in that interview. Usually if you say, no, we're staying on the record, they're still going to talk. They want to tell you their story. They want to tell you what's going on. So most of the time, if you make it clear that you're staying on the record, they're not going to end the interview. Tell them, one of the things that you can do to convince them to stay on the record is that you can tell them that you need the attribution for the sake of credibility. In order to be able to print what you need to print, you need to give credit to the person who said it. And that if you don't have a person to attribute it to, there's no point in writing it. Or you can always return to the topic in an on-the-record question later in the interview to get your quote. So sometimes if somebody says, you know what, I'm going off the record right now, this is what happened. When you go back to your on-the-record interview, you can ask a question about it and try to get them to answer it on the record. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. A lot of it depends on how savvy the person you're interviewing is at giving interviews. A little bit about your sources. Some sources will want to remain anonymous simply because of their position, their job, or the information that they're giving you. If you agree to keep their identity private, it is unethical to reveal their names to anyone. That includes your editor, that includes your supervisor. It doesn't matter how close you are to them. If you agree to keep a source anonymous, you cannot reveal their identity. However, there are two exceptions. Government subpoena is the first one. If it's determined to jeopardize the national security or is essential in solving a crime. So if you know if you have an anonymous source who's given you information that is essential to solving a crime and you're given a government subpoena, you have to tell us who they are. The other one is publication policy. Due to some problems with reporter integrity, some publications are now requiring reporters to share the identity of the anonymous reporter with their supervising editor. That should mean that you would only need to share it with them, and that would be based on the policy of your individual publication. But that also means that your editor then would be unethical for sharing that information with anyone else. Sometimes to use caution, beware of sources that have an axe to grind. So sources that are upset, enraged, mad about things, you need to be very leery of what they tell you because it may not all be 100% accurate. Also, do they have their own agenda? A lot of people have their own things that they want to accomplish. And sometimes by speaking to you, rather than helping you get your story, they're out there trying to make their own accomplishments. Also, are they telling the truth? You always need to verify information through more than one source whenever possible because people lie. And are they reliable? If they're known to have substance abuse issues, that leads to suspicion as to whether or not they're always going to be telling you the truth. And that's just one example. Do they really have a direct connection to the news event? You need to be careful of hearsay. A lot of people want their 5 minutes of fame. So if they heard something from someone else, they'll call a newspaper and say, all of a sudden they'll change it into they were the ones who said it or they were the ones who witnessed it. And you need to be very careful and ask a lot of questions to make sure that you're actually getting a truthful and accurate account. Some common problems for beginner interviewers. Beginning reporters are often afraid to ask probing questions that might anger the subject. Sometimes the questions that you ask are going to be difficult, but you have to remember that you are there to get the story right above all else, and you have to be willing to ask those awkward questions. They also get manipulated by the subjects who give a lot of sanitized, canned responses. People who give interviews frequently oftentimes have prefabricated answers that say nothing or don't necessarily answer the question but sound really good. You need to be very leery of those. You also need to remember, though, that persistence pays. When conducting an interview, make sure that your key questions are answered. You should know what the specific questions that have to be answered by the end of your interview. If the subject does not know an answer, Ask them who in the organization is available to respond. Oftentimes, if they don't know, somebody above them will, and if that person will talk to you, you can get your answers. Many subjects will also try to escape accountability through doublespeak and passing the buck. They'll say, well, I said this, but in reality I meant. Or they'll say, well, I wasn't really aware. This person did this. So they'll try to place the blame somewhere else. Also remember that you should leave no stone left unturned when you're conducting an interview. When you write your story, you should have answers to all of your key questions. If you don't, then you should include an explanation for the absence of the clear information. For example, a spokesperson declined to comment on would explain why you're missing some information. The cause of the fire was still undetermined. Another example, the company isn't disclosing the amount paid for the acquisition. However, the financial terms are expected to be revealed in tomorrow's filing with the SEC. All three of these examples explain why there's information missing in your report and give an explanation of when that information might be available. If you're writing a feature or profile story, go beyond the main subject interview to get the full story. You want to talk to everyone they know. Talk to friends and family members to help get a diverse perspective on the subject who's being interviewed. And your writing style will likely include observation and details that would not be appropriate in a news report / article. For instance, you may report on how they were sitting, the tone of their voice, maybe even what they were wearing or where you chose to do the interview. When it comes to investigative reporting, be prepared to spend a longer amount of time preparing for this piece. Investigative reporting takes a lot of research and oftentimes months of interviewing lots of people until you're able to have enough information to write an accurate story. You must strategize in how to ask your questions, as well as who to ask the questions to and when to ask them. When doing investigative reporting, if you ask the wrong questions at the wrong time, you're never going to get the answers you need. For example, at a certain point, your inquiries can result in actions that impede or prevent further investigation. So if you ask the wrong person, all of a sudden you're going to shut everyone down. So you need to be very careful as to how you conduct investigative reporting. Some interview skills that you need to be concerned about. 1, don't talk too much. You're there to get the interviewee to talk. So the interviewer should ask their questions and ask follow-up questions, but don't turn the interview into a conversation about yourself. You want to keep the guest and the topic on focus. Remember your key questions, the key information that you're looking for. Don't ask overly complex questions. You want to keep your questions fairly simple so that your interviewee can process what you're asking them. If you're going to ask some very complex questions, make sure that you explain them and that you're willing to ask the question again or even break it down into smaller questions. Mainly, though, in order to be a good interviewer, you need to listen. You need to be paying attention to what they're saying so that you can adjust your questions and make sure that you're not asking them the same question twice. And make sure that you're asking good follow-up questions, even if you don't have them written down, to get the full story. Make sure you ask follow-up questions. You need to offer nonverbal feedback to responses. So, shake your head a little bit when you agree, or, do the humming. Ask for clarification if necessary. You're not going to be an expert on everything you ever interview anyone about, so if you don't understand something they're saying, ask them to clarify it so that you can write a good story. One of the things you also need to consider when you're preparing for an interview is the types of questions that you want to ask. First are closed-ended questions. These are answered with a simple yes or no. For example, do you like your job? Well, that's a yes question. If I say yes, I've answered that question. Generally, when you have a lot of close-ended question, it makes for a bad interview because you're not creating that dialogue between you and the interviewee. Instead, you want to ask a lot of open-ended questions. Open-ended questions provide an opportunity for broad, expanded answers. For example, what do you like about your job? What are your favorite things you do at work? What parts of your job would you rather not have to do? Those kinds of open-ended questions lead to a much better conversation and interview. Avoid leading questions, things like, you don't like George Bush, do you? Instead ask things like, how do you feel about George Bush? Avoid obvious questions. Were you happy when your movie flopped? Well, of course they weren't. Nobody would be happy to know that a project that they spent months on failed. So don't ask that. Also, keep your cool. Maintain control of the interview. Sometimes it's very easy for the interviewer to get off topic, or the interviewee to get off topic, and you need to remember that you are in charge. Know when and how to interrupt to keep your guests from rambling. Maybe you need to keep them on topic. You need to also maintain a neutral and objective view. You are not there to voice your opinion, whether you agree or disagree with what you're covering and what your interviewee is saying. You are there to get the story. You want to also build to the point. As I said previously, save your most volatile questions for the end of the interview, if at all possible. Begin with easier questions to establish a connection and trust with your guest. And also, be prepared. Prepare questions beforehand. Troubleshoot your interview before it occurs. Look over your list of questions. Know where your interviewee might stumble or might be caught off guard. Plan your questions ahead of time. You probably won't use all of your questions, but the process is helpful in establishing a focus to your actual interview. Also, you're going to need to check for accuracy. Inevitably, you're going to encounter a need to clarify a quote or note that you have taken during the interview. That's okay. Call your source and ask them. Okay, it's also not uncommon to fact check with a subject by following up directly with them after the conclusion of your interview. In some cases, a quote is read back to confirm that it is accurate or to ask for clarification. If you are going to quote somebody word for word, make sure that what you're writing is right. Fact checking. Be cautious when a subject presents a statistic as if it is fact. You need to make sure that the statistic is true. Be prepared to confirm all statistics with an independent source. One of the best things I ever learned in journalism is the statistics are often manipulated, and they're meant to be. There's a difference if I say 9 out of 10 people completed their homework, well, that sounds really great. But I could turn that statistic around and make it sound really bad if I wanted to. By saying maybe 9 out of 10 did complete their homework, but I could turn that around and say 300 students didn't complete their homework. Well, that could still mean 9 out of 10, but 300 sounds like a much more horrible statistic. When it comes to using quotes, and I've hit on this a little bit, only use a quote if it conveys something that can't be communicated better in your own words. It's often better to paraphrase what your subject has told you, so to put it in your own words. Use a quote if it's particularly articulate or powerful in the wording, but most people do not speak in a way that translates well into a quote. The more significant the interviewee is, the more likely a reader will be interested. Make sure that the quote is used to add a unique angle or credibility to the story. If the grammar is poor, then some reporters will clean up the quote. This practice varies by publication, so you need to know whether your publication allows that or not. However, if the interview was witnessed by multimedia outlets, for example, it was a press conference, then you should leave the quotes alone. You should not clean them up. The idea of sick. If you want to be cautious, then you can use sick notation in your printed quote to notate a grammatical error that's made by your subject. That way, you're saying, this is what they said, but yes, it's wrong. Observation is also an important part, especially in feature and profile stories. Sometimes a key part of the story lies in what is observed rather than spoken. Pay attention to the body language or nonverbal cues from your subject. Alright, I've covered a lot in this video and I apologize for its length, but interview is important because if you can't conduct a good interview, you're never going to write a good story. Your assignment associated with this is to answer these 5 questions. Number 1, explain why it is important to build trust with the person you are interviewing. 2, list 3 things that could hurt the trust relationship you have established with the source. 3, what does it mean if someone wants to be off the record? 4, what are the best types of questions to ask in order to have a good interview? And 5, when is a good time to use a direct quote from a source? Please answer these 5 questions in complete sentences in the submission box for this assignment. If you have any questions about this assignment or any other assignments for this week, please make sure you contact me via email and I'll be more than happy to get back to you as quickly as possible. Have a good week. Thank you.